Hey everybody, my name is Colette Crosby and I'm with the League of Women Voters. Welcome to the Kitsap County League of Women Voters meeting to review the Kitsap County Comprehensive Plan, which is due in 2024. Our guest speaker is Eric Baker. He's the Deputy County Administrator for Kitsap County. He'll be talking about the comprehensive plan and addressing the key elements, as well as various sets of guidelines, and public commentary will help shape that plan, or how they will shape that plan. Our hope is that you will leave this meeting understanding the contours of the plan and how you can submit your comments to any part of the plan that interests you, or at a meta level about the whole plan end to end. We are a hybrid meeting today, so if you wouldn't mind going on mute if you're dialing out on Zoom, we can make sure Eric can be heard in the meeting venue and online. Now we'll be taking questions periodically as we go. If you're on Zoom, you can post them to me on chat. And as you know, we're recording this session. So over to you, Eric, and welcome again.
Thank you very much for having me. Again, my name is Eric Baker. I'm the Deputy County Administrator for Kitsap County, overseeing the comprehensive plan update, as well as a whole host of other commissioner-directed projects, open space acquisitions, regional coordination, jack of all trades. So I appreciate your time today. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try not to be redundant of presentations that I gave back in October. I think everyone had that presentation. I'll try to cover the big ticket items, but again, I don't want people to feel like, wait a moment, I already saw this. So give me 1 second. Can everybody see my screen? Yes, no? Yes, okay. So we're now moving on into the second phase of the comprehensive plan update. That area is going to cover a lot of goals and policies, and I'll kind of work through some of this as I go through the presentation. So in general, the comprehensive plan is a piece of the overall planning puzzle for the state, region, and county. Basically, the first element of all this is the Growth Management Act. That is a state statute that requires all jurisdictions of particular sizes to develop plans to accommodate growth. That growth is both population and employment, and now has a strong housing component to it, which you would think is pretty much intersects pretty well with those other two, but honestly creates a series of other complications, which I'll cover here in a moment. After the Growth Management Act, we then have a regional plan that's called Vision 2050. That is through the Puget Sound Regional Council, which is an organization which Kitsap County is a member and participates in its activities, but also covers King, Pierce, and Snohomish counties. So obviously a lot of our employment, a lot of our residents have a strong connection to those counties, and we want to make sure that we are planning consistent so that their efforts and our efforts line up as well as they can, as we are all very different communities. And then getting a little more granular, you come down to the countywide planning policies. That is where the county, the cities, the two tribes, Squamish, Port Gamble, Sklallam, and our largest ports all work together to work on population, employment, and now housing allocations for each of our communities, so that again we are coordinating within Kitsap County on how that growth is going to be accommodated and exactly what kind of impacts it may have to our community over time. So we have multiple local comprehensive plans. I'm here today to talk about the unincorporated counties comprehensive plan. Each of the cities are required to update their own comp plans. So that's Poulsbo, Port Orchard, Bremerton, Bainbridge Island have, again, concurrent processes moving on. Through the Kitsap Regional Coordinating Council, the jurisdictions are coordinating all of these efforts together, but they are all independent tracks. So please, if you want to comment on the city of Poulsbo's activities, make sure that you're commenting through their comprehensive plan process, not necessarily mine. We try to pass along information, but again, they're all independent processes. As I indicated, each city has their own, and coordination is key. Pretty much, while the cities are not responsible for following the county's comprehensive plan, there is, again, the ensuring that, especially in areas that are intended to annex over time, that the development opportunities, transportation infrastructure, and wastewater infrastructure are all somewhat consistent, so that as these annexations occur, there are not dramatic differences as you move from the city to the county, and in certain cases back into the city, depending on what part of the county that or what part of the county that you are in at any given time. So generally, a comprehensive plan, again, the Growth Management Act has 14 goals. Those 14 goals range everything from urban development to public participation, providing affordable housing, addressing environmental impacts. All of these goals are non-prioritized. So the county has to take all 14 of them and then balance these very divergent interests into a consolidated document that serves all of them to one degree or another. It's not like of the 14 we can say, okay, we're just gonna do these 7 because that's the ones that are most important to us, and the other ones are just what they are. We have to consider them all. We need to balance them all, and in certain places there's going to be direct conflict, which I'm going to cover a little bit today, like in instances of ensuring adequate housing for our community while also protecting the environment. They're two things that sometimes rub up against one another. But some of the goals and policies and the elements that I believe you have received some notifications from the county indicating that we are updating are the land use chapter. That's the zoning, how big our urban areas are, how we're protecting the rural areas as it comes to densities and development patterns. We have economic development, which is, okay, the land use chapter is kind of where everybody's living. The economic development is, okay, where are all these people going to be working? And that's not just in county. That is in county, that's naval installations and the other side of the water in a lot of ways. And we need to make sure that those 3 work together. If you're going to have this many people working here and this many people living here, how is it going to impact our environment, our critical areas, our shorelines, our aquifers? How is this development not going to create adverse impacts? Transportation, how are people going to be able to get from their job to home and back again? Parks and recreation and open space. I think we all appreciated our parks. We all appreciate the natural beauty of Kitsap County, but I think COVID taught us a lot about how valuable those are, having them in your community, not having to travel long distances, because people utilized and loved our parks and open spaces in ways and volumes we had not seen before COVID came along. Then capital facilities. We need to make sure there's enough pavement, there's enough transit, there's enough pipes in the ground to be able to turn on your faucet and flush your toilet. There needs to be enough police. There needs to be enough capacity in school systems. The fire districts need to be able to have enough people to come and address the community. All that needs to be accommodated in this as well. Housing, which I mentioned previously, this is a much larger focus of this update than it has ever been before, as we are amidst a housing crisis. That is not just of homelessness and affordable housing. That is housing affordability. How do we have housing types that are affordable to a number of different income bands, not just the very lowest income bands, but people who are working at the shipyard. We're finding a number of folks who are working for some of our key primary employers struggling to find housing, either own or rent in our community. So I'm going to be covering that a lot today. And then certain communities like Kingston, like Silverdale, Suquamish, Manchester have their own sub-area neighborhood specific plans. Those don't necessarily supersede the countywide plans, but they are additions to the countywide plans. Let me pause there and see if there are any questions about what I've said so far. I have many other slides to go, but I don't want to bite off more than I can chew.
No questions on Slack yet. I mean, on chat.
All right, so moving along. What is the general structure of the plan? A comprehensive plan is intended to be an aspirational document. It is what Kitsap County wants to be when it grows up, and what are the impacts of that aspiration? How is it going to impact, again, the environment? How is it going to impact capital facilities? So that all starts, again, usually with a mission and a vision, and that is a very broad, relatively brief statement, usually about protecting quality of life, ensuring public transparency and public access, and then protection of the environment, all the various things. But then in the individual elements, we start getting down into the goals, which is really, okay, for, let's say, economic development, what type of jobs are we generally looking for? What kind of employment are we looking for? And those are general interests. So those are pretty broad statements. Each goal has to have a series of policies, which is generally direction towards those goals. It's like, okay, here's what you want to see happen. The policies are, okay, here is how you can direct yourself to that over time. Remember, this is a 20-year plan. So everything that the comp plan says they want to be isn't expected to be here year 1, year 4, sometimes not even year 10. This, again, is intended to happen incrementally. Progress is a journey. Progress is not a destination. So it is important to kind of look at the goals, policies on that this is a journey of progress over time. And then lastly is kind of the strategies. It's like, okay, this is what you want to be. Here's how you think you can get there. Okay, what are the specific actions you're going to take to make those policies happen? So that is oftentimes making alterations to development code, providing specific incentives to certain types of development. That can be certain types of capital investments in non-motorized facilities, things like that. So again, each goal has policies. Not every policy has a strategy, but in general, the strategies need to feed the goals. So as you're going through the existing comprehensive plan, the one adopted in 2016, please take a look at the fact that we are trying to ensure that we are thinking aspirationally, yet you can see a through line onto exactly how this could occur, again, over that 20-year continuum. So how have we been going about reviewing the elements kind of internally? Since 2022, we have been working very hard at looking at what our existing comprehensive plan says, but then looking at it through 3 primary lenses. The first of which is state law has evolved since 2016. A lot of bills have passed. Those bills have new implications, largely in the areas of housing and climate change, 2 big areas that have been, there's been additions that jurisdictions must take observation of. Then there's consistency with Vision 2050. Again, that is that regional 4-county set of goals. It also covers things like housing, climate change, growth, but it also has a real focus on equity. How are we ensuring that we're providing services and we are structuring development patterns that serve all of our community, especially those that are disproportionately impacted or vulnerable in nature. There's also a strong BIPOC aspect to a lot of Vision 2050's goals and policies. And then it's consistency with the countywide planning policies. As the county and cities are all planning together, again, how are we centering growth in a way that makes transit affordable, makes sewer access affordable and cost effective? And again, how we are generally coordinating transfer of governance. If annexations are to occur, how could that be happening? Through those 3 lenses, we looked at our 2016 plan, and with help of a consultant team, we saw, okay, here are the gaps. Here are the places that the current plan does not address at all, needs to be amended, or here's some things that are just flat inconsistent with new code. So that is kind of where we're kind of starting off in many ways. And then, and just as importantly, we are looking at evolving community needs and desires. There's all these things that we have to do from the top down, but then what are some of the things that the community wants us to alter over time? How do we want to grow from the bottoms up approach? And that's a lot of what we're going to be doing. We're doing right now with some of the solicitations we've made regarding the elements and some of these presentations that you've been seeing, so that folks can participate and kind of help draft or provide ideas for what kind of goals, policies, and strategies they would like to see. I'll cover some of that public involvement here in a moment. Let me pause there and see if there's any questions.
Yes, we do have a question from Jessica on chat. And her question is, what process is the county using to assess the impacts on equity? Is the county using equity tools from the Puget Sound Regional Council?
Yes, we are looking at a number of equity tools. We are looking at both equity from a geographic perspective, but also from a demographic perspective. Kitsap County has a lot of community members. They don't necessarily all live in specific geographies. When you're talking about the other side of the water, you have certain communities that have certain demographics that point to certain equity issues. Kitsap County, outside of our two local tribes, we have a much more dispersed pattern of our vulnerable communities, as well as members of the BIPOC community, et cetera, that we need to focus equity on. They live in Seebeck, they live in Bremerton, they live in Silverdale, they live all about. So we need to look at it not just from the geographic, okay, how are we planning for this area, but how are we planning for the county as a whole in a manner that helps them demographically be able to, A, participate in county government, B, receive services that they need to meet all the needs that our residents have, et cetera. So yes, we're using the PSRC methods in kind of walking through a number of those. We're also bringing on a diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator at the county to kind of help provide some technical guidance as this moves forward.
There's a follow-up question. Jessica is also curious if health and healthcare are included in the focus on human services. She observes health tends to be separate from human services.
At this point, we have not historically handled a lot of healthcare in our comprehensive plans, largely because our role in it is relatively small. And obviously that has been growing over time. COVID really kind of hammered home the importance of healthcare. I think a lot of jurisdictions are going to grapple with this is a very important component of our community, but exactly how can we create change? Again, the idea of the comprehensive plan is really to direct county action in a lot of ways. So yes, I do expect that there is going to be a healthcare component to our human services section. Exactly what the breadth of that is going to be is still kind of being grappled with. I think there is a conversation going on right now about a hospital district and how that could potentially improve healthcare in our community, especially for those who are more vulnerable populations. I do expect that to be included in the comprehensive plan, but it is important for us to understand that we don't want to create obligations in the comp plan using words like must or shall on things that the county cannot directly make happen, as that creates expectations in the community that are not accurate and oftentimes can cause people to work on different issues than really that they should be to achieve their goals.
And then one last question. Is access to food included in human services? Things like availability of grocery stores. We seem to have some food deserts.
Yep, I believe that is actually included in our existing comprehensive plan. We have worked on addressing food deserts through our local food system. Again, trying to provide healthier foods that are locally sourced. I think our farming community has a very big interest, and they've been providing comments about exactly how their role fits and how the growth of the county has kind of impacted the small farming. But then it also comes down to food processing, food distribution, and then ultimately, I think the main question we have here is, again, the outlet for purchase. And there will be a component about working on those types of aspects. What those strategies look like, I think that is something that will be very helpful for the community to participate so that we are moving in the correct direction that works for, again, Kitsap County, not necessarily a model that works for a larger community that has a much larger agricultural community. We have a very valuable small agricultural community here in Kitsap County, but taking measures from Skagit County or Yakima County just might not fit in our, again, much smaller development pattern and more diverse development pattern, especially in our rural areas.
Thank you. Then there's a question from Pat. I understand the Kitsap County's Department of Emergency Management. They are just beginning to plan for climate change with the flooding in the north of the county and in the Gorst area. Does that Does that get included in this planning process? Any of that work?
The Department of Emergency Management is a component. We are going to be looking at climate change. I do have a slide coming up. I'll be talking about that a little more. Yeah, resiliency is going to be key for our infrastructure. Obviously, we want to ensure that people's homes, people's businesses are all protected. But a lot of our effort is really going to be working on, okay, how is sea level rise going to affect our road system, like you saw in Gorst and like you saw in the North End? How is it going to impact our sewage treatment plant or our sewage treatment pump stations? Will there be a possibility that sewer spills occur based upon sea level rise, that there are tides and king tides and heavy rain coming together? So yes, that is going to be an aspect. We do have a certain component. We may even be creating a climate change chapter. There's a recent House bill, a recent legislative bill that called 1181 that requires jurisdictions whose plans are due in 2025 to have a climate change. We are 2024, so it doesn't directly apply to us, but we will have to meet these requirements eventually. And it would be very beneficial for us to at least start to establish a foundation in a climate change chapter that would cover sea level rise, resiliency, as well as wildfire risk, which again, while that has not hit us as hard as others, we do have large tracts of forested land that can create a interface that is negative for potential wildfire.
Thank you. That's it for the chat.
All right. So moving forward, here were some of the questions that some folks, I think, from the League of Women Voters kind of wanted me to hit on. I think I may have touched on a few of these, and I will touch more on them as I move forward. But obviously, we reached out on on a certain list of elements. These elements, again, were the ones that have, again, some of the broadest implications to the county, but also I think we cover most of all the potential chapters in the comprehensive plan outside of the sub-area plans. The sub-area and neighborhood plans are largely being handled by the individual community councils. An example would be Kingston, who has a subcommittee. They're also working with the Port of Kingston on having these types of conversations. But more broadly, the public input that we're soliciting right now on our existing goals and policies should pretty much apply to all of the elements. Most of those have story maps, basically a pictorial illustrated opportunity on our website that allows you to, when we talk about a particular goal and policy, provide some visuals to go along with it. You can provide comment through that avenue. You can also provide more global comment just through the county email. That would be compplan@kitsap.gov. So those are some ways that you can participate early and often. I'll also talk about some additional public outreach opportunities that are coming forward. I'm going to talk about some that have the most broadest impact on the county as a whole. That's largely going to be the land use chapter, and it's also going to be the environment chapter. We have others. I'm not saying the others aren't important, but those are the ones that pretty much set the table for all the other chapters. And I'll talk more about those in a moment. Which elements have received the most comment thus far? We have received a lot of comment on the environment chapter. There's a lot of interest, again, in the climate change aspect, as well as how to protect our natural environment, streams, wetlands, shorelines, etc. And we also have received a lot of comment on the land use chapter, which is, again, wanting to keep the urban growth areas compact as possible, not expanding them unnecessarily, and to provide the necessary housing types. So people who are just moving out of the house or people who are aging and need a different type of housing can find a location in Kitsap County and don't have to look elsewhere. And then which elements appear most likely to be revised? I think you're largely going to be looking at land use, environment, and housing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about those here right now. So the land use and economic development chapters, they really are the structure that basically says, okay, you have X number of people moving to your county. That's roughly about 70,000 people coming countywide between now and 2044. You have a large number of employees who are also coming to your community. And also, you now have to accommodate those in certain housing types. So we need to accommodate the number of people that is estimated by the Puget Sound Regional Council through Vision 2050, and then filtered through the countywide planning policies, which establish specific numbers that we are trying to achieve. The idea of, well, just don't plan for the growth and it won't come, that does not work. Honestly, that creates a scenario where people still want to move to your area. Housing prices are based on supply and demand. If you don't provide the supply and the demand remains high, the price goes up. And that's been an element of what we've been seeing, as I think statewide, and especially Central Puget Sound wide, we have not been providing enough housing, period. And we certainly have not been providing the right type of housing. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Like I mentioned before, this is the chapter that establishes the urban growth areas. Urban areas are, again, intended for intense development, 5 dwelling units an acre or more. So again, more housing developments, bike lanes, sidewalks, transit, sewer service, like actual pipe to plant to bay sewer service. All of those are intended to be in urban growth areas, and those are supposed to be just big enough to handle your growth projections, no more, unless there's a really pressing need to do so. And Kitsap has a long checkered past with the sizing of our urban growth areas, which I have been riding along for the last 30 years. Rural zoning. Once you get out into the rural areas, you start to see exactly how we are going to protect the rural areas from additional growth. Again, urban is where the growth is supposed to go. Rural is supposed to be protected from growth. And it really comes down to how big should lots be allowed to be in the rural area? What kinds of allowed uses are out in the rural area? Unlike a lot of other communities, our rural area is very diverse. I always liken it to someone took all the potential rural uses, put them in a bag, and then just spread them out over the top of the county. So while you do have some agricultural areas like Big Valley, like Olalla Valley, you drive down, you have a housing subdivision, you have a farm, you have people who are doing ATV driving, and then you have people who just large tracts of land for passive their own passive recreation uses. So it's really hard to get a handle on some of the true character of these areas based upon each one of these groups feel the rural area is their use, not everybody else's. So there can be some conflicts on that. And then we get down to the location of resource lands. This is less of an impact for the county, but generally that comes down to timber, mineral resources. While I mentioned we do have small scale agriculture, we don't have any agriculture that is large enough to receive a commercial agricultural zoning. So we do not have that in Kitsap County. But the resource lands are largely, again, where can people mine, which is basically dependent on where the mineral is, not the type of thing that we have a lot of control over. But then it comes down to large timberlands, predominantly those owned by the Department of Natural Resources around Green and Gold Mountain, and also out towards the Tahuya area. Let me pause there and see if we have any questions about the land use and economic development chapter. Again, once you establish all of these densities, all of these urban growth areas, you start to get really what is going to be the impact of this growth on our road system, on our capital facilities. And then all of that comes with a dollar amount. If you have to put in this many additional roads, you have to put in this many additional sewer pipes and pump stations, how much is that going to cost? And how is it going to get paid for? Is it going to be through regular property taxes? Is it going to have to be through another avenue?
I have a question on chat. Can you expand on the checkered past with respect to urban growth areas? You had, it sounds like you had some examples in your mind.
Painfully. Obviously, Kitsap County was one of the last to come up with a valid comprehensive plan. The Growth Management Act was adopted in 1990. We adopted our first comprehensive plan in 1994 that was viewed non-compliant. We then adopted one in 1996 that doubled down and actually ended up becoming invalid. That's as bad as it could be. And then in 98, we came up with a valid comprehensive plan. So during those times, we, again, were pushing back heavily as growth management, the idea of tight urban areas And then heavily protected rural areas was very foreign to Kitsap County in 1990. If you drive out in our rural areas, there are 1 acre lots, and on the shoreline, there are 3rd acre lots. So again, the idea that if you're in the rural area, you're going to be on a 5 acre lot or bigger, and in the urban areas, you're going to be in 5th acre lots or smaller, was very foreign, and there was a lot of pushback from the community and ultimately the Board of County Commissioners. So that's ancient history. So in 1998, we adopted the plan. We are required to update our comprehensive plan at 1.8 years. Now it's every 10 years. As we go through that, we get new growth allocations. And in 2006, we did a comprehensive plan that had expanded urban growth areas, what was ultimately perceived to be too much. So we had urban growth areas that after it went through the Growth Management Hearings Board, where the county prevailed, after it went to Superior Court, where the county prevailed, ultimately we lost 6 years later at the Court of Appeals that said, no, your urban growth areas are too big. So in 2012, we had to redo them again. And we had to shrink our urban growth areas by about 25%. Rubber banding urban growth area boundaries is very detrimental. It's detrimental because during that 6-year period, both public and private investment and planning were done for these areas that now can't be developed as urban. So you'll note if you go down, especially in South Kitsap, if you drive down Phillips Road, south of Sedgwick, you'll drive down through a bunch of small farms. You'll go past Lake Amelia, and then there's a big housing development out there. It's like, well, where'd this come from? That was at one time inside an urban growth area boundary. It was vested during that time. It has a sewer line and it is proceeding, but it is out in the rural area. So sizing our urban growth areas conservatively is something that we've worked very hard to do over the last decade to avoid, again, this rubber banding approach. We have had a number of court appeals, as I've mentioned. The county has prevailed in some, lost in others. Either way, you're going to see Kitsap County a lot more in the Growth Management Policy Board rulings than probably anyone would like. So we're working very carefully to utilize the learned experience from those in this update.
Thank you. Couple more questions. The first one is, how do the transportation issues that come up in the comprehensive plan overlap with Kitsap Transit's strategic plan?
They are intended to be closely intertwined, though I do have the expectation that the comprehensive plan, our comprehensive plan, and likely some of the cities as well, are going to be pushing on the expansion of intra-community transit. Most of our efforts at Kitsap Transit are really focused on getting people from employment centers to ferry docks, and we have a pretty good frequent system for that during the morning hours and the afternoon hours. But again, that gets you from Poulsbo to the Bainbridge Island Ferry. That gets you from Silverdale to the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. That doesn't get you from, say, the Central Kitsap High School to the St. Michael's Medical Center, and can do it multiple times during the day. Those types of routes don't exist as much as we need them to. So obviously we're going to be working very closely with the bus rapid transit plans, the ferry plans, et cetera, for Kitsap Transit, but likely we are going to be pushing again pretty heavily for the expansion of regular intra-community service, so that people who are living in a multifamily unit can realize that I can get from point A to point B on a bus. I do not need a car or a second car because I can make that happen. Having the service in the morning and the afternoons are great. That keeps people off the roads during those periods of time, but does not necessarily get to a point where people realize they don't need a second car, or maybe not a car at all. And when you're really talking about density, where people are going to park is a big issue. If you have an apartment complex, where are all the people living there going to park their cars? And the fewer cars you can have to address, the better off you're going to be in providing, again, that dense urban environment that the Growth Management Act is looking for us to achieve.
Another question here is, how are septic systems and their monitoring and maintenance included in this planning process? And a related question is around private wells.
When you're talking about private wells, you're largely talking in the rural areas. We do have a smattering them of the wells in the urban areas, and as well as we have a good number of septic systems still in the urban areas. Illahee is a good example, inside an urban area, but largely driven by septic. We are going to be looking very closely at exactly how what we call the unregulated wells. Those are, again, the single wells located in the rural area, as well as potentially some of the six-pack wells. That's a set of 6 connections that aren't as regulated as heavily as some of the ones you see in the urban areas, the ones that are run by Kitsap Public Utility District, West Sound Utility District, the various cities. All of them have, again, municipal permits with the Department of Ecology, so their amount of water that they're pulling out is heavily regulated. The septic system issue is complicated. Obviously, there is an argument that septic systems can help recharge the aquifer over time. Obviously, if the septic system's working well, that's what we want to see happen. If it's not, we kind of like it not to percolate down to the aquifer. But if you are spending so much time on sewer, where basically you are running water out of a well to a home and then running it out to a plant and then ultimately out to the bay, you're not recharging. That being said, urban areas are are supposed to have sewer systems. So septic system is not only frowned upon, in many ways prohibited for new development in urban areas. Independent wells still allowable in urban areas, but generally most people are going to connect to Silverdale water, to Annapolis water, something of that nature. But when you get out into the rural areas, we are going to have to get our arms around exactly how much rural growth are we having and how much impact would additional rural growth have on our aquifers through those single or 6-pack wells that, again, are not so as heavily regulated, and we don't have as great a handle on exactly what their cumulative impacts are going to be. So those will be rolled into our environmental impact statement, and in certain degrees our capital facilities plan, but again, only as applies to the large municipal entities.
One more question. Should composting toilets be a solution, or could composting toilets be a solution to septic tanks?
I would have to say that there's a number of ways to kind of work around the septic tank scenario, but much like all of that, it all comes down to how well they're maintained. And obviously, some people maintain things well, some people maintain things poorly. I think composting toilets, if everybody use best practices in using them, could be. Though there are some things that can't go in composting toilets that ultimately need to be disposed of, and they're going to have to be disposed of in a different manner than a lot of folks currently do by flushing them down to the toilet. So again, there's a lot of human nature that would need to work into such a thing. And then kind of going back to, okay, how do you avoid the negative impacts of people who aren't using best practices? So again, going back to the kind of the less regulated water systems, these would be less regulated sewer systems, which I think could create some environmental hazards, again, if people did things particularly bad, or if a group of people did things particularly bad, utilizing a system that does not have as much regulatory oversight.
Thank you.
All right. So the next chapter, again, this is one that we've received a lot of comment on and is near and dear to most people's hearts in Kitsap County, and that is the environment. I think when people say quality of life, this is a big chunk of what they're talking about. They're talking about the beauty of our stream systems, our wetlands, but really what the environmental chapter is trying to do is it is attempting to protect these critical areas. Wetlands, streams, slopes, and aquifer recharge areas. A lot of that goes into the development regulations of the critical areas ordinance, but a lot of it also kind of goes down into what lands is the county acquiring to help protect aquifer recharge. So there is a regulatory component to the environment chapter, but there's also a incentive chapter. There's a lot of grant money available to acquire land, particularly sensitive areas, put them in public ownership or nonprofit ownership that then protects them over time. Oftentimes that is a better avenue than going at it from a regulatory standpoint. So this chapter kind of focuses on both of those. Going back to the resiliency question that someone raised previously, is this chapter also covers frequently flooded areas, GORST, the areas up north king tide, heavy rain type scenarios. The FEMA works very closely on this, and that works both for our infrastructure, how to protect it, but also how to protect people who are building in and around floodplains. I already talked about preserving open space. Shoreline management, we have miles, I think 237 miles of shoreline, and of course, even thousands, if not tens of thousands of acres, or probably hundreds of thousands of acres of views of shorelines. How do we end up protecting those for salmon, for people, for residents, but also for people who are visiting our area? So it is a whole bunch of different interests all intersecting, not just as most people focus on salmon and wildlife habitat. And then I already talked about climate change. Likely that climate change segment may be pulled out of the environment chapter and then put into its own chapter. Again, establishing some foundational elements, not addressing all the issues, but again, starting that conversation as we move into the future years on how to address climate change on a local level in a manner that works with regional efforts. There's always questions and comments on the environment chapter, so I'm definitely going to pause here.
There's a question, is there any opportunity down the road to buy out people who are in high risk of future flooding areas like Point No Point or Gorst?
There's definitely funding that is available on occasion. Usually that involves a full-on natural disaster and a repeated instance of natural disasters. That usually comes from the federal or state. There is no local funding for that. Obviously, some places are going to be cheaper to buy out than others. Obviously, the properties on Point No Point are going to be, even if they are dramatically impacted regularly by sea level rise, they are going to be pretty expensive to address. And then, of course, the areas down in Gorst, along Gorst Creek, you have some lower value properties, but you also have things like the car dealership that is located there, also very expensive. Most of those types of avenues come through the federal and state, and usually are related to some kind of natural disaster or series of natural disasters. So that's why it's so important that when these types of things happen, we declare an emergency and work to have the state declare an emergency as well. All right, the last section I'm going to spend a certain amount of time talking about, because this has always been important, but is substantially more important right now due to our housing crisis. And again, oftentimes you'll hear us talk about how to protect the natural environment and how to provide for the built environment. But the place where those two rub up against one another is the human environment, the people who live in our communities and have grown up in our communities. How do we maintain them and provide them a future to continue to live in the county? It's great if the homes and the businesses look a particular way, provide a certain number of businesses, but if they are all too expensive for the people who live here today or the people we hope to live here in the future to occupy, and they have to live in Thurston County or Jefferson County, we're losing a key component of our community that the built and natural environment alone cannot replace. So I just kind of put that as kind of a holistic Hallmark greeting card statement on what I'm about to talk about. So the housing chapter addresses things like homelessness, equal access to housing, affordable housing, and then it also works very hard to integrate housing with services and transportation. Again, there is a little bit of health floating through here, but not as much as you're probably going to see. And we are really soliciting folks to propose goals, policies, or strategies that relate to health in a way. Also, this is probably a location where a lot of our equity issues are going to be addressed, because this isn't just a housing chapter, this is housing and human services. Transportation I'll come back to, because while I'm talking about housing, I should have sorted these a little bit better. Like I kind of talked a little bit about this already, but housing affordability is the biggest issue that we are currently addressing. Our home prices are upwards of $500,000 now on average. Largely that's because we have homes that are too large or only single family residential. One of the interesting statistics is our homes have more bedrooms than they have occupants. So we are overhoused in a lot of ways. And of course, the larger your home is, the more expensive it's going to be. And if that's the only thing you really have a lot of in your community, that is going to create pressures on the lower income folks who work in our communities. It isn't just people working at restaurants. It isn't just people working at gas stations. It is people who are working in the school system. There are people who are working in the fire districts. Again, core public servants that need to have places to live in here. And we're starting to see some of the realities that the Seattles and the Bellevues and to a degree Everett's are all kind of seeing in the inability for folks to be able to live in the community while working in your community in, again, incredibly important jobs for our quality of life. Housing is not going to get cheaper, whether it is the market going up. Again, we have a lot of very affluent people who are moving into the community, mainly the Seattle side, that are now moving to our side. So again, more money to buy housing oftentimes leads to higher prices. Regulation does have an impact on housing prices, either by requiring additional materials, requiring different labor. And of course, we're already having supply shortages as it comes to both of those things. And then also when it comes to other aspects, we really need to curb the tide of the increase in housing. And a lot of that comes down to how do we incentivize housing types and sizes that meet multiple income ranges? Honestly, the 2,200 square foot single family detached residence that is probably 85 to 90% of all the housing in the county right now is likely never going to decrease in value, or wages are going to get high enough in value that people making 30% or 50% of annual median income, annual median income's around $87,000, that's people making in the 40,000s, to be able to rent a single family detached home or to be able to buy a single family attached home at that size and at that housing type. We need to be focused in the next 20 years on those other housing types that are not necessarily found, and smaller units. The idea of a starter home is something that is very foreign nowadays, as most homes are built again at that 1,800, 2,000 or more square foot size, even as starter homes. We need to be thinking about smaller housing types, and again, different housing different housing sizes and different housing types. So what do I mean by planning for different housing types? If we're not looking at single family detached, we are looking at a number of other options. That is what's called missing middle housing. That is things like townhomes, duplexes, row housing, things that again are oftentimes smaller in size. There's more in a particular area. And then also we're also talking heavily about multifamily housing, apartments and condominiums. Those are places that people need to utilize either as a starter home or one that they can utilize just to provide safe and secure housing, which again is a big chunk of our homelessness problem, that we just don't have the supply of these units out there, almost regardless of price. So Commerce has kind of helped us by providing some housing guidance. Kitsap County has acknowledged the fact that it's needed to diversify for a number of years, and we've been taking a lot of steps towards that. However, Commerce, through a House bill, has required a pretty dramatic shift for our planning. We need to be planning for housing types, not just population. So if you remember, I mentioned that we have a certain number of people that are expecting to come here through 2044. Well, this new guidance now establishes, okay, you have this many people. Here is the number of housing units you need to have. And here's the number of housing units by income band: 0 to 30%, 30 to 50%, 50 to 80, 80 to 100% of annual median income. So again, household sizes and rents that are $1,700 a month or less for housing costs. We need to be providing opportunities for that in these numbers, and we need to plan for them. That is dramatically different than what we have done in the past. the jurisdictions based upon these targets, what is the county supposed to be helping with that? We're supposed to be removing regulatory barriers to the development of that kind of housing and providing incentives for that kind of housing. And how can we go about doing that? How can we make it more attractive for a property owner to want to develop something other than single family detached housing on their property? And then again, like I mentioned, CalMERS provided specific housing need targets, and those housing need targets do not match the population targets particularly well because we have such a large amount of single family housing. We have a lot of capacity for people, but a lot of that capacity is currently wrapped up in single family zoning. Thus, there's a substantial amount of multifamily zoning that needs to be provided to provide those additional housing units, which is creating some additional complications. That was all a lot of wonky talk. So I'm going to pause here for people to say, Eric, what did you just mean when you said blank? Or follow up with any additional questions. I have a little more about housing coming up here in a moment.
We do have a question. What are the possibilities for mixed use development and for taller heights for multifamily buildings, like 6 or 7 stories rather than 5 stories?
Kitsap County is focusing very heavily in this update on exactly how we again increase maximum densities and increase building height, making sure that they're commensurate with one another. We've done a great job at times of creating more density or creating additional heights, but we never really synced them up. So either we gave more height than we needed for the density limits or vice versa. So places like downtown Silverdale, talking about Silverdale as a 24/7 community, is going to require multifamily housing. It's going to require 5-story construction or higher, whether it's mixed use or outright market rate housing, or outright multifamily housing, hopefully with some affordable housing components as well, with commercial around the outside of it. That doesn't, when I say those types of things, people say, well, are you saying we're going to bulldoze Silverdale and everything's going to go away and it's going to be something entirely different? If you take a look at some of the aerial photography of Silverdale, it is a lot of parking. There, you don't have to tear down too many buildings to be able to provide opportunities for new construction. A lot of Silverdale is built for the retail heyday. And even that retail heyday wasn't built for retail parking need in July. It was for those 2 weeks around Christmas. So we were already overparked before the retail boom ended and is now hemorrhaging with the advent of online shopping and people shopping in a lot of other different ways. So you can recreate a downtown area without necessarily tearing down that much. You just need to be utilizing your existing unused parking in a different manner. And that could include either mixed use development, commercial on the ground floor with residential above, mixed use where commercial is next to a residential unit. But the key component of that, everyone talks about, well, the community is really interested in that. And we have developers who are interested in that. The person you need to convince is you need to convince the property owner, because Kitsap County, while we need to redevelop, we have a strong Navy presence. The strong Navy presence provides, again, good family wage jobs that keeps Kitsap County relatively stable when it comes to its economy. We don't see a lot of blight in Kitsap County. You don't see Aurora Avenues. You don't see areas like some of the outskirts of Parkland. Large swaths of old commercial or old residential development that's like that area could really benefit from redevelopment and has property owners that are like, I could make a lot more money by redeveloping. The people in Silverdale or people in Central Kitsap, they're currently cashing checks for what they're doing on their property today. We need to create an environment where they're willing to forego that smaller today check to invest a significant amount of additional money for a much larger tomorrow check. Because a lot of our issues can be addressed through public efforts, but honestly, our housing crisis needs to have a strong private component. The private developer needs to see the value in smaller housing units And we need to create an environment where those are affordable to construct. Let me pause there and hope I answered the question very belaboredly.
Thanks, Eric. A question is median. Sorry, my dog just decided to bark. Is median income determined for the county or regions of the county?
It is largely for the purpose of Commerce's guidance. It is for Kitsap County as a whole. So obviously places like Bainbridge are going to have higher median incomes. And as we're going through this, we are going to have to look at that adjustment. Places like Bremerton sometimes have lower median incomes, but generally we're operating off of that 87,000 number. At least most of our jurisdictions are when we're talking about 100% of annual median income.
Great. And then there's a related question. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, which is if a third-party organization in the county does a needs assessment, as for example, Kitsap Community Resources, what's the best way for that information to be made available to the planning process?
I would definitely submit it to the comp plan website, compplan@kitsap.gov. I do believe that we have been working very closely with Kitsap Community Resources. I think we're finding a lot of information related there consistent with our housing needs analysis that was done back in 2020. But if there are particular strategies by nonprofits like Kitsap Community Resources, we are very interested. This isn't an effort just to see what's in the toolkit. We're literally going down to Lowe's and we're seeing what are all the potential options we could have. And if people like Kitsap Community Resources have some innovative ideas, we are definitely open for business on all of those.
Great. And then a related question is, how is the county able to, is it doing outreach with BIPOC communities, communities with disabilities, Spanish language first? How's that outreach going?
We are working on, again, the BIPOC communities, not as much Spanish language, though that is coming this summer. We have been working with, again, our disabled community, our differently abled community through our Human Resources Division, also through a series of nonprofits on exactly how to make things more ADA accessible in a lot of ways. Again, it kind of goes back to how do we handle our equity issues in a demographic manner, as there is definitely not a geographic area where some of these community groups live necessarily. That allows us to focus on, okay, this 10-block area, we need to be doing X, Y, or Z. It's more of what do we need to be doing county-wide. So again, we are very open to additional opportunities. We've been reaching out at varying times throughout this process. But if there is a more robust avenue for us to get in to that conversation and receive that feedback, we would love to have the opportunity, though likely it involves seeing me again.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So I think just kind of going back to the housing thing, like I said, we're single family detached and our zoning matches. So we are going to need to open up our single family zones to more missing middle housing, townhomes, etc., and potentially some multifamily at higher densities. That has been a question for a number of folks who moved into a single family neighborhood. It's always been single family and have perceptions about additional density that usually are not positive. So as we start opening the door to these, we're going to have to be very careful about making assessments and not prejudging density just on the face of perceptions. I think I've already covered a number of these slides. Like I mentioned before, 80% of our current zoning capacity, when you look at our existing urban growth area boundaries, 80% of that zoning capacity, the number of units we can put in there, is in single family zones. So that's going to put a lot of pressure on our multifamily zones to achieve much higher densities, like the 5 to 7 story buildings that was mentioned previously, but also for us to be able to have a greater number of duplexes, townhomes, cottage housing opportunities that hopefully are sized at a level that again minimizes its cost. And that is where a majority of the housing focus is going to be, which is going to be very different for a lot of folks, as most of our comprehensive plans have been really kind of focused on just people. And the market basically says the people in Kitsap County want to live in a single family detached residential home. And we've been doing that for decades. A lot of our incentives, a lot of our regulatory reform to actually make housing easier and cheaper are going to be focused again on missing middle and multifamily housing. And a lot of that is going to be focused in places like Silverdale, like Kingston, and like the central Kitsap corridor there along 303, moving from Bremerton to Silverdale.
That's a really interesting statistic about how 80% of Kitsap's zoning capacity is in existing single family zones. Can you explain, like, what does current zoning capacity mean? Like, is it just acreage? Like,
so what we do is we take our existing, this is super wonky, but what we do is we have our existing urban growth area boundary. Here's how many acres are within it. And then we go and we take out all the areas that are already built and aren't going to redevelop. Then we go and we take out all the critical areas, and we take out all the roads, and we take out all the future roads, future stormwater. So that gross acreage gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it reaches what we call net developable acreage. This is the land that's remaining after you've taken out everything else that is necessary for homes that can actually handle housing of one kind or another. That then you multiply by a number of units you expect to see per acre, and that turns into people. So when I say zoning capacity, that is roughly, when you look at all the zones, so single family zones are roughly what we call urban low or urban restricted. Again, usually allowing between 1 to 9 dwelling units an acre in a lot of ways. Those are single family zones which have historically been developed only with single family detached housing. And when you take a look at our existing urban growth area boundaries and you do that painful Excel calculation on how many people you're fitting in there, 80% of those people are 80% of that capacity fits in those zones that historically have been single family detached, which again means if we're going to be pushing missing middle and multifamily, these zones have to play in a certain way. So the downside is we have all this multifamily need. We have very small amount of area to put it in because we have dedicated so much of our past to the idea that single family detached housing is what Kitsap is and what always will be, and there's no downsides to it. And now we're seeing the substantial downside in the form of housing prices and rental prices that are out of control.
thanks. I know Bainbridge Island recently did something like this, or I believe they did. They're allowing homes of a certain size and septic capacity to add an ADU. And so this question is similar. Is there a consideration of allowing for multiple housing, like a family compound on large plots where parents, might own the land right now?
Kitsap allows accessory, there's a difference on accessory dwelling units between urban areas and rural areas. In urban areas, it's strongly encouraged. We allow up to 2 accessory dwelling units on every parcel in our urban growth areas. So again, accessory dwelling units strongly encouraged. New legislation has come forward about ADUs that also reduces the costs of doing those accessory dwelling units, largely in the area of impact fees. When you move out in the rural area, it's a different story. Accessory dwelling units are oftentimes households moving out into the rural area, and that is perceived as rural growth or rural sprawl. So generally, ADUs in the rural areas are not necessarily encouraged. They're not outright discouraged, but it's very hard, as we again are supposed to be focusing our growth in urban areas, whether it is a standalone home or an accessory dwelling unit. So in urban areas, yay. Out in the rural areas, much harder and not necessarily something the county incentivizes, though we entirely see the argument for somebody who owns a property out there and would like to have their kids or their parents who are moving back in with them have their own standalone home rather than having to live in the main residence with them, which again, sometimes it's a little too close for some families. Any other questions? All right. So did I cut out?
No, we can still hear you.
Okay. I can't see anyone's face, so I can't tell if I froze or not. So again, now we're going to kind of talk about outreach. I think a number of folks, I recognize some names and faces. We have been doing outreach since the early part of 2022. We have been using a combination of in-person, but we were coming out the back end of COVID, so there's been a lot of virtual efforts. We have been trying to mimic workshops that people can actually talk amongst themselves like you would if you're sitting across a table from one another virtually. That's had some success. And we have, when we've reached out to people, said, how do you feel about Zoom? We have a flat 50-50. 50% of the folks say, hey, we'd really like to have in-person opportunities. The other half are perfectly fine with Zoom. So we're trying to kind of find that balance. Though I will note that even the people who want the in-person opportunity want the hybrid approach like you're doing tonight. It's like, yeah, we want to be in person, but we really like to also be able to have Zoom, which of course sometimes can be problematic as not all rooms have adequate technology capabilities. The owls are only so good, and that's a system of cameras that works sometimes, doesn't work other times. And when you're doing a county public event, you really can't have wonky tech. What happens there is you now have people who tuned in to participate and now can't because something went wrong. So it's a delicate balance. But please sign up for our email blasts. We send those out regularly. Every time we have something new to talk about, or a new document or a new meeting, we send out, again, through social media, email, and our website, opportunities for you to participate. Those, depending on who you talk to, they're too regular at times. And I'm fearing I'm starting to pop up in a few too many people's spam folders. So we are, again, trying to balance that. We did a series of, again, those public workshops, both virtual and in person. We went over all the various elements, trying to establish kind of a baseline of understanding for people who attended on what the land use chapter does, what the transportation chapter does. We then have been working on land use alternatives so that we can do environmental analysis. Like I mentioned, we have growth targets, both population, employment, and housing. We have had to produce zoning options and policy options that cover all the potential futures to accommodate that growth, so that we can do an environmental review and we can do a capital facilities plan, which again will say, all right, if you accommodate this many people in that way, it does this to the environment and costs this much money for you to provide services to it. That's what's currently underway. I'll talk about that a little more in a moment. And then we had the in-person open houses. Some of those were well attended. Some of those a little less attended, where there was just as many staff there as there was public over a 3-hour time period. So again, we're trying to balance those. Also, I'm pretty certain a number of you have seen me at one point or another giving a spiel and saying words very similar to what I've said today at a number of different community groups and interested parties. I've given 24 presentations over the course of summer to various organizations, again, utilizing the every outhouse, henhouse, and doghouse type approach to presentations. And then we had the standard mechanism where you get to talk directly to your elected officials or appointed representatives like the Planning Commission. We've had public hearings before the board and Planning Commission for people to provide testimony. All of these have either been workshops where people have had the opportunity to provide oral comment. They've all had opportunities for chat, etc. And then when it comes to the public hearings, people were able to testify, and pretty much all of these opportunities, other than the individual workshops, have been videotaped, and they are available on our website. So if you weren't able to attend any of them, you could watch them in marathon format after this meeting is over. Let me pause there about previous outreach and see if anybody has any questions.
Nothing online. How about you, Maureen?
We're muted here, but there are no questions at this time.
Okay. So I guess on a time check, how much additional time do I have with you, or have I already overstayed my welcome?
Not at all. You skipped a slide about transportation. Have you covered that sort of in?
I just so I don't forget it, I might as well go back to it right now. So, and then transportation is another one of the big ticket items that likely are going to have a certain number of changes, because again, growth generates trips generate need for both regular single passenger roadway infrastructure, but also non-motorized opportunities. So the transportation chapter talks about, again, levels of service. Exactly how much traffic can appear on a road before an improvement needs to be made, either at an intersection or in the lanes. How do we ensure the safety of our road system? But also, how do we diversify options for bikers and pedestrians? Obviously, as you're moving between communities through our rural areas, our options are more limited. But when we're talking about like redevelopment of Silverdale, we want to ensure that we have a walkable and bikeable community. So people don't necessarily just have to depend on their car or transit, that they can take a bike or they could walk. We're trying to avoid super blocks, where it's just pretty much the blocks are just too long to be able to achieve any kind of real walkability. So we're going to have to look at that when we're talking about Silverdale. I talked about safety of our roadways and also encourage the transit availability. Transit availability is going to be critical. On the other side of the water, where growth is probably about 10 to 15 years ahead of us, they have a lot more transit opportunities. While we may never have, and not in my lifetime, we're probably ever going to have a light rail system, we can have more regular bus service, and we can have people who are utilizing them. The important part is not to view that as a chicken and egg endeavor. Usually multifamily and density doesn't want to develop until you have the transit infrastructure in place. And historically, we've not provided the transit infrastructure until there's people there to ride it. Probably we are going to have to invest in buses and bus routes that are not well used on the front end, with the idea being that that is going to be one of the key catalysts to getting density in places we don't see density now, because people, they are really looking for a bus to be able to move around communities, again, if they are looking to not necessarily have one car per person. And then we need to ensure that there's adequate funding for maintenance and capital projects. We do have the local road fund. The local road fund has historically provided a big chunk of our capital projects, but as you build new roadways, after a certain number of years, they need to be maintained. Well, actually, they need to be maintained all the time, but the maintenance gets a lot bigger. So now we're finding that our road fund is more and more maintenance driven and less capital project driven, which means fewer improvements are getting made to expand roadways, to expand non-motorized facilities. So we need to be keeping a close eye on that funding. Any questions about transportation? Okay, so one of the things people want to hear about are what have we heard so far throughout all this outreach? And again, we've heard a lot of a more general, we want to maintain the quality of life of Kitsap County, which means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But to get a little more granular, again, the protection of the environment and taking meaningful climate change actions, we've been receiving a lot of comment about. Again, housing affordability is another, not just affordable housing for the very low income, but just they need places. People say, I need places for my kids to be able to move to once they move out of my house, which they kind of say with a little bit of glee, like they're kind of looking for them to be able to move out of their house. And if I want my parents to come back and live with me, I need an opportunity. There's general support for the draft environmental alternatives, though we have 3 alternatives. I didn't really spend a lot of time on that in this presentation. The first alternative is the way things are today. The second alternative is really that concentrated growth, putting as many people in as small an area as possible using vertical construction like multifamily. And then you have alternative 3, which is the one that follows more our historic development patterns, a lot more single-family detached housing, and also requires larger urban growth area boundaries to accommodate. There's a lot of concerns about impacts to rural areas and the preservation of small farming. Small farming has been impacted by the fact that more and more people are subdividing their land and selling to non-farming related endeavors. Farming does have some byproducts that come along with it. Sometimes you have to have fertilizer. Sometimes animals produce fertilizer. All things that sometimes create conflicts in the rural area. But the biggest being that farming needs larger tracts of land at affordable prices. And when you subdivide them and all of a sudden the price of a 5-acre piece of property goes to $150,000, being able to buy a 10 or 15-acre property is just financially infeasible, considering our farming activities are usually so small and not generating large quantities of revenue. Usually people have another job as well as farming, and that doesn't necessarily fuel a long-term farming environment. And then there are concerns about particular urban growth area expansions that are proposed in the alternatives, and I'm going to hit on 3 of those just really briefly. Probably the biggest point of comment that we've received since we've been talking about the alternatives, and even before that, is the proposed addition here south of Island Lake. To kind of give people a little bit of point of reference, this is Central Valley Road. Moving up, it goes up to Keyport. This is Island Lake, of course. This is the Island Lake community. This is the Krista Shores camp. There is a request for this area to go into the urban growth area, moving from rural residential to urban low. That would allow 5 to 9 dwelling units an acre and would allow for a lot of additional development in an area. We've heard a lot of comment about the concern about the impact of Barker Creek, which runs through the middle of this property. Concerns about the impacts to Island Lake. However, the water generally runs from Island Lake away, so there may be limited impacts to the lake. But one of the big ones is, how is it going to affect transportation? How are people going to be able to get out of this? Utilizing, anyone who's driven through the Island Lake area knows that the roads are somewhat substandard. And then ultimately, what's it going to mean to Central Valley Road? All of these homes through here are, again, part of a small farming community. What is that going to ultimately end up doing? Second one also includes Barker Creek, but areas to the south. Again, to orient ourselves, this is the southern part of Central Valley Road, continuing down, moving down towards Walmart. This is Nelson Road, and this area down here in purple is our fairgrounds. There is a swath of rural in between the Silverdale UGA and the Central Kitsap UGA. And we have a certain number of property owners who want to expand the urban growth area boundaries into this area surrounding Barker Creek, this parcel here and these parcels here. Obviously, the concerns about the impacts to Barker Creek. And now at this part of Barker Creek, you're really talking about some prime salmon habitat. As you get up closer to Island Lake, there's a lot more impact from human activities over time. So there's a lot of fish barrier. Once you get down here, you're now talking about a lot more pristine habitat, and people are severely concerned about the impacts to Barker Creek for those potential UGA expansions. And then lastly, in the south end, I don't want to give the south end short shrift. This is moving south on Phillips Road. Sedgwick Road is right here. This is the light. As you move south, there is a number of housing developments that are going in through here, but there is some folks who want to expand the UGA moving down towards Lake Amelia and towards that housing development I was talking about previously that was developed when it was once in an urban growth area boundary. A number of people are concerned about the continued expansion in that direction, though there is a sewer line currently in the road. So there is an argument for, could that be urban development sometime in the future? Let me pause there before I move on to some of our tribal comments. Any questions about those? I feel I've worn everybody out.
We're doing fine here in the room, so please continue. We're interested in your tribal.
Okay. So that's one thing that I probably did not focus on when we're talking about the BIPOC community. Is obviously probably our largest BIPOC community is our Native American tribes. Kitsap County staff meets with our tribal governments every 2 weeks. And that isn't just Port Gamble, S'Klallam, and Suquamish. That is other folks who have what are called, it's called UNA in our community. That is the Squaxin tribe. That is the Skokomish tribe. That also to a degree is the Puyallup tribe. So all of these tribes we meet with every 2 weeks to ensure that we are providing them adequate information about our comprehensive plan, and we're addressing their concerns related to how we accommodate growth. So I did not give that adequate attention when we talked about reaching out to our BIPOC communities. Again, the tribal comments they are very concerned about the environment. They're concerned about fish habitat. They have general opposition to conversion of particular rural areas and even some particular urban areas to higher densities. So whether that is taking a rural area and allowing another home on it, or whether that is an urban area, instead of being allowed to develop 1 to 5 homes, now being able to develop 10 to 20 homes. They have concerns about the potential implications to the environment. There's general opposition to expanding the urban growth area boundaries for a lot of the same reasons. They want to make sure that they are protecting the environment, and urban development can, from their viewpoint, have substantial impacts on that. They have opposition to any kind of rezoning in the Suquamish limited area, more intensive rural development. That's basically the Suquamish area. That's fancy planner speak for generally the town of Suquamish. The Suquamish tribe is looking to recapture some of its land in tribal ownership, and the further subdivision would just confound that effort. One of the bigger comments, and the more surprising, was that the Port Gamble S'Klallam tribe referenced our 5-acre rural zoning as being sprawl. That is historically not been the way that this has been viewed. 5-acre zoning has largely been considered part of our rural character, but it is something that we're going to have to discuss either in this update or in future updates as we continue to focus on how our rural areas develop, or in many ways don't develop. They support focused growth in the urban growth areas, again, compact development. However, they are concerned when that development again gets too close to critical areas. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And they're also very interested in promoting incorporations and annexations. Neither Silverdale or Kingston are incorporated cities. Obviously, there are reasons for that. The tribes are very interested in seeing those areas turn into cities. That's something else we need a little more conversation about, as obviously urban development is urban development, but I think they view cities as having a more fixed boundary than the county's boundaries, which again are more flexible. And every 10 years, we have to have the conversation about, are they going to get bigger? The hard part about our urban growth areas is, again, we need to accommodate our growth projections. We want to protect the environment, but we also need to make sure that we aren't making construction too expensive or making it unable to be done in our urban areas. So oftentimes when you're providing wider buffers on streams, you're taking away land that could be developed for density. If you're not putting people in that land in your urban growth areas, sometimes you need larger urban growth area boundaries. So in many ways, it's very hard to keep the urban areas compact and ensure that you are expanding protections for streams and wetlands in the urban areas. The two butt heads pretty substantially. It also has extreme cost implications. Having to run a sewer line in a manner to avoid critical areas sometimes can require a pump station. And while running a sewer line is expensive, that pump station that is necessary to get the sewer either going uphill or downhill, depending on where you are at the time, can cost $1.5 million. If you're doing a 9-lot short subdivision, you cannot afford $1.5 million pump station, which means that land is likely not going to develop. It's not going to turn into units. Yet we have done an excellent job for protecting the environment. So again, like I mentioned at the outset, there is a balance, and in many ways, protecting in the urban areas, protecting the environment, and ensuring that you have cost-effective and affordable housing can butt up against one another. let me pause there and see if anybody has any questions.
Well, I'd like to ask, looking down the road, once the work is done, it goes to the 3 county commissioners. Is that the process in the end?
Yeah, I can skip ahead to that. So holistically, this is how we get to the end. We have a current schedule that targets October 24th, 2024 for conclusion. We just selected the preliminary alternatives that are going to get reviewed for environmental impact statement, the comp plan goals and policies revisions, regulation revisions, and capital facilities plan. So basically over the next several months, we're going to be meeting with the public about the goals and policies, but we're going to be doing a lot of the technical work that says, okay, if we do these things, what does it mean to the environment and what does it mean from the cost of infrastructure? That'll be released in October. From there, we're going to have a number of other public workshops, et cetera, throughout the fall and moving into the beginning part of 2024, where we talk about the implications of the environmental impact statement, the costs of the capital facilities plan, and how some of our goals and regulations could be modified. I'd love to be able to come back and talk to you folks as this moves forward, and this would be one of those key components. So, because ultimately the board's going to have to take the 3 alternatives we're currently reviewing and say, okay, here is the one alternative that we are going to be proceeding forward with. So that is where a number of ideas either make it into the alternative or fall out of the alternative. So between October and February is a very key component of public participation, because the board is going to have to direct staff on the preferred alternative. From there, we're going to complete the final documents that come out in June and have one last round of public comment. At that point, we're going to be making tweaks to the documents, no wholesale changes for potential development in or potential approval in October. But again, we have to be done by December. I'd like to stay out of the holiday season because nobody likes coming to a public meeting in November and December. So ultimately, it is the 3 Board of County Commissioners who are going to be making these decisions as we move along, educated by public comment. Just like all the public comment that we received, the board took into consideration when they created the preliminary alternatives. That same suite of public outreach opportunities are going to be key in establishing the preferred alternative and establishing the final documents.
So just one observation, that February 20, should it be 2024?
Yeah, you'd probably say, unless I have a Wayback Machine and manage to somehow go back in time.
All right, well.
That is a excellent observation.
Okay.
See? Fixed.
Okay.
So some of the, if people are looking to be involved right now, like people, I would like to be involved right now. Please visit the Kitsap County website and go through the story maps that again describe a number of the elements. Also, if you would like, you can provide comment directly to the comp plan webpage. We are going to be having workshops, both virtual and in person, as well as open houses coming through the summer. That's going to be focusing on things like the environment. It's going to be focusing on things like the land use and environmental and economic development. We're going to be talking about transportation. Again, things people want to see in our goals and policies as we think aspirationally. We've received a lot of comment thus far, but we want to continue this comment so that when we release our first draft documents in October, it's educated by that public output or public comment before we go and do even more public comment, because some people, they like to participate, but they like to participate when they have something to look at and say, okay, I like that or I don't like that, versus the more organic, holistic conversation, which sometimes could be a little more challenging for people. And then if you are in the areas of Kingston, Silverdale, or the central Kitsap urban growth area, that area along 303, Illahee, Tracyton, around the fairgrounds area, we do have the Central Kitsap Community Council and the Kingston Community Council that are having specific conversations about their sub-area plans right now. So please interface with them and you'll have additional opportunities to get information and provide public comment.
Colette, do you have any further questions or comments?
Nope, no more questions.
So again, this is the comprehensive plan web page in big ugly yellow, and then there is the web address. The QR code that you've seen throughout this presentation also takes you to these. So if you just want to snap it on your phone. Are there particular things that the League of Women Voters had wished that I talked about more, yet don't necessarily want to hear about it right now? I can understand that an hour and 35 minutes of hearing one person talk is a lot.
No, I mean, I think this has been excellent. And you certainly helped us understand the right venues and forums to participate going forward and also to give comments.
We agree here in the room and really appreciate the time you've taken with us, Eric.
Well, great. Well, I really appreciate you giving us this opportunity. Again, we are open to come as often as you'd like to see us. If there's particular topics of interest, I can definitely send or have somebody present who is not me, which could also be a benefit. Obviously, if it's about the environment, likely Kirby, who works in our shop, is a good person to talk about that. Transportation, we bring Public Works, a number of other folks. If again, there are more targeted conversations League of Women Voters would like to see as this process moves forward. Again, we're fully open for business for all ideas, as again, we are moving in to somewhat uncharted waters as we really try to provide a housing type and a housing type that has entirely different impacts in many ways to Kitsap County that are not necessarily the way we have developed in the past. And certain elements of the community will like those changes. Some may fear those changes. And again, it's going to be in that balance that is going to be important between now and the adoption of the plan, but also moving forward into the 20-year planning horizon.
We are recording, again, as we said, your presentation, and we will do a simple edit and put it on our YouTube channel and send it out to our members. So it will hopefully reach a wider audience than today. But this has been great.
Well, I want to thank you guys again. It has been great. And again, I always appreciate you guys giving me this venue